think what I'll do is to read out from a letter Ray had written to me once, and also something I wrote, more or less on the same subject that he touched upon in his letter. He said quite clearly, I don't think Indian art traditions have had anything at all to do with my development as a filmmaker. I thought it was a very strong statement. It goes on to say later on, I'm firmly of the opinion that cinema is a product of the West, where the concept of an art form existing in time has been prevalent for several centuries. Indian culture shows no awareness of such a concept. If I have succeeded as a filmmaker, it is due to my familiarity with Western artistic, literary and musical traditions. Add to that my observation of Indian life, and you have my prescription. Well, my feeling was that no matter what he thought about his own work, what he said about his work, and what the work says about him are not the same. And I went into this, tried to think about this, and felt that reading what he says about his life in Santiniketan, the 2.5 years he spent here, one gets a clue to the contradiction within him between what he thought he was and what he really was. He describes Santiniketan. It was a world of vast open spaces, vaulted over with a dustless sky, that on a clear night showed the constellations as no city sky could ever do. The same sky on a clear day could summon up in moments an awesome invasion of billowing cloud darkness during the monsoon that seemed to engulf the entire universe. And there was the Kwai, the soil-eroded edges of down-growing land, with its serried ranks of palm trees, and the river snaking its way through its rough-hewn undulations. If Santiniketan did nothing else, it induced contemplation and a sense of wonder in the most prosaic and earthbound of minds. In the 2.5 years I had time to think and time to realize that almost without being aware of it, the place had opened windows for me. More than anything else, it had brought me an awareness of our tradition, which I knew would serve as a foundation for any branch of art that I wished to pursue. Santiniketan taught me two things: to look at paintings and to look at nature. It was Santiniketan which opened my eyes to the fact that the kind of painting that I used to admire, that provoked the reaction, how lifelike, should be a preoccupation that lasted only 400 years. It started with the first awareness of perspective in the 15th century and ended with the invention of photography in the 19th. The first representations of nature by man are believed to be the Stone Age cave paintings of 20,000 years ago. What is 400 years in a span of 200 centuries? Neither Egyptian nor Chinese, Japanese or Indian art ever concerned itself with factual representation. Here, the primary aim was to get at the essence of things, a probing beneath the surface. Nature was the point of departure for the artist to arrive at a personal vision. 2 trips to the great art centers of India, Ajanta, Ellora, Elephanta, Konark and others, consolidated the idea of Indian tradition in my mind. At last, I was beginning to find myself and find my roots. Obviously what we have I go on to say, obviously what we have here is markedly different from what he asserts in the excerpt from his letter to me, which I read out earlier. I would say that what Ray derived from Tagore, from Santiniketan, and from Indian tradition is possibly best summed up by what Pauline Kael said about his work, an essential quality of his work, which she described as the mythic in the ordinary. This perception of the mythic as a kind of sense of cosmic space and time as a background to human action, no matter how unimportant the action is infused into his work in an imperceptible way, giving very ordinary things a kind of significance which is more than what the shot itself and the action itself contains. This is a very difficult quality to describe. It's something that the mind radiates into the work. It's something that can be described at best as humanism. At least one aspect of it is humanism. And this humanism needs some explanation, because humanism means different things to different people. Humanism in the West came with a kind of anthrocentric concept of the universe. The man was in the center of the universe, was in control of everything, was superior to everything, and that's humanist. Whereas this humanism is very different. It's a Buddhist humanism. It's an ancient Hindu humanism, which has compassion towards all living beings, and a kind of resignation, a kind of oneness with the flow of life, the inevitabilities of it, and which is aware of the insignificance of man, that how small man is in the whole context of the universe, of time and space. This awareness of this small speck, tiny speck that man represents, is humanism, and it is something that is present in Tagore's work throughout, in everything he did. Here there is a kind of balance between man's awareness of what he can do and what he can't do, what is beyond him, and how he's a creature of circumstance, of things that happened before his birth and will happen after his death. There is a problem in understanding Ray in that one is aware of the Western side of him and the Indian side, as it were, and the relationship between these two. The relationship between these two is something that had already been predetermined, as it were, by the Bengal Renaissance, because so what the Renaissance brought up was the concept, the feeling, the underlying idea that India is India, that between the West and India there's a kind of give and take, but it does not destroy the Indian identity. That India, no matter how much it absorbs from the West, it will still remain India. And I think one sees that in his work. it is impossible to ignore the contemplative aspect of his work, and that contemplativeness is an extremely, essentially Indian characteristic. It is something that you do not find in Western filmmakers. Take the case of, say, Antonioni, whose pace is slow, like Ray's, but whose concept of pace is something that is posited against the currency of in European Western life and art and society. But the natural tempo is fast, but the tempo in Antonioni is slow, is deliberately slow against what the social idiom says. Here in Ray, the opposite happens. He lived in the urban environment where the tempo was fast. It was in fact a little like the Western tempo. But he finds the essence of the tempo of the country itself. The Indian tempo, which is not determined only by the urban reality, but in the reality of the entire country, and the pace that obtains in the villages, in the bullock carts grinding along the village paths, that pace is somehow find its way into his films. And this is why many American and Western critics, in fact, especially in the beginning, criticized him for being slow. I remember Stanley Kaufman in America repeatedly referred to this. And Truffaut walked out of Pathe Panchali. He found it too slow, excruciatingly slow. So his slowness is something that the West slowly, gradually came to accept and began to understand. It's not something that was natural to the West. It was not something that was natural to any filmmaker. Any filmmaker from a country like India, or for that matter any other country, cannot really separate himself completely from his background. Something remains which is beyond the conscious mind, the mind's choices. Thinking of Maladme's dictum, rien n'est dit, tout est suggéré. Nothing is said, all is suggested. I think of, again, of Pauline Kael, who said that what in Ray's work is made obvious becomes small, ordinary. So what in Ray's work is suggested becomes infinite. And she is one of the very few people who understood this in its essence. Ray's understatement was at one time equated with the British understatement, the stiff upper lip kind of thing, which I realized later on was a very superficial way of looking at it. The understatement is there in Indian society itself, and if you spend any time in the Indian villages amongst ordinary people, you see a great deal of understatement. That they do not declare their passions, their thoughts aloud in the way people think they do. Of course, in all societies there are people who are loud, there are people who are mild, but there is a general character within the Indian rural society which is imbued with a fatalism, that whatever happens, happens. That fatalistic attitude is very very deeply embedded in Indian society and Indian rural society even more, because of which understatement comes easily to it. So the understatement is not a British way of understatement, which is a very conscious kind of understatement. This understatement is a natural understatement.